Hi all! Today we'll be visiting the third largest island in the world, Borneo, where artist-explorer Tony Foster traveled in 2015 to paint caves and rainforests. Borneo is located in the far west of the Pacific Ocean, and it is bisected by the equator. It's one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. The island is divided into 3 territories, each belonging to a different country: Indonesia, Brunei, and Malaysia. And it is the caves of Gunung Mulu National Park in the Malaysian territory that we'll be zooming in on today, since this is the area Tony specifically visited for his exploring beauty journey. The Mulu Caves were nominated by luminary Robin Hanbury-Tennyson, an influential explorer and friend of Tony's. Hanbury-Tennyson is well known for being one of the founders of the human rights organization Survival International, that campaigns and advocates for the rights of indigenous, tribal, and uncontacted peoples around the world. He has had extensive experiences in Mulu National Park and with its indigenous people, the Penan. At Mulu, Tony chose to paint Deer Cave, a massive limestone cavern with an opening measured at an incredible 146 meters high. The cave is spectacular and home to millions of bats that stream out each evening in search of insects. Tony painted the cave opening from just inside its mouth, tolerating the overpowering stink of literal tons of bat guano covering the cave floor. He produced this artwork, titled "Looking Out from Deer Cave, Mulu, 6 Days." Here, the interior of the cave is seen strewn with rocks and boulders, no doubt debris from eons of gradual bedrock erosion that contributed to the cave's formation in the first place. Because rocks are a subject found in all kinds of landscapes, I'd like to focus in on them for today's painting demonstration, inspired by the moss-covered boulders we see in this painting. Of course, rocks come in all shapes, colors, and sizes, but they still share some common features. One characteristic of the rocks in this painting is that Tony Foster has rendered them with lighter and darker areas according to where sunlight streaming in from the cave mouth is hitting them. For my demonstration today, I'll pay special attention to the light and dark areas of my subjects, and use that to give my rocks their own sense of volume and weight. I've chosen these 3 rocks for today. If you're following along, you may paint these from the screen or gather your own rocks to paint. One final thing before we get started. If you haven't yet watched my materials video, be sure to check it out for what supplies you'll need to paint alongside me today. I'll be using a basic watercolor set: watercolor paper, a pencil and eraser, water, watercolor paints and brushes, and some paper towel. Let's get started. So the first thing I've done is laid out my rocks and tried to identify a light source. In my case, since I'm working in a studio, it's pretty easy. I can just direct a lamp to shine light a certain way, in this case casting shadows this way towards the right. But if you're working out in the field and you have the sunlight as your light source, then the shadow may not be so directional. You'll want to draw and then paint what you see. Now, for this watercolor painting, as always, we're going to begin with a drawing and try to capture some of the features that are in these rocks to give us a bit of a guideline to help with the watercolor process later. For the sake of time, I've gone ahead already and created these drawings, but let me take a second to walk you through my thinking for each of these. For the granite stone, I've created the main contour, the outline, and then blocked in a little bit of where some of the major shadows are on this stone, again as a guideline for when I'm doing the watercolor. I've also gone ahead and included a very light outline of the cast shadow. But notice that I haven't done a whole lot of the details here that make the granite such a textured rock. All of these little dark marks, I've intentionally left those out of this drawing, except for a couple here of the prominent ones, because I'm going to do that work later with the watercolor. This chiseled face rock, on the other hand, has a lot more detail on the inside than the granite rock did. I've also gone ahead and added some of the prominent dark areas, the shadows, where I see those occurring. And then of course, like in the granite rock, I've added a very light outline of where the cast shadow is. And then finally, this volcanic pockmarked rock. I've done most of the pockmarks in here, most of these little holes, and some of the more prominent, some of the darker ones I've even emphasized with some shading with the pencil. And to me, these are pretty important because They're not just superficial color changes that we're seeing, they're actual indentations in the rock that form a big part of its actual feature and shape. So I've spent plenty of time trying to capture those with the pencil before I jump into watercolor. You'll want to spend time paying attention to the particular features that make your rock unique, and then denoting anything like facets and irregularities in your rock. What different planes can your rock be broken down into? Let's start with the watercolors. So I'm trying to create a base color for these rocks. If we're looking at the granite rock, for example, it's kind of a dull, muted gray. I'm looking at sort of a foundation color for this. As we know, one way to create grays is to mix complementary colors and sort of dull down those colors. I'm going to try French Ultramarine with cadmium yellow, so get a little bit of water going. We'll take some French Ultramarine in here. And then some cadmium yellow. And blue and yellow, of course, is going to make a sort of green, so I need to mute that further. But because this is a very warm yellow and this is a cool blue, the mixture of warm and cool complementaries is going to make a pretty yucky, murky secondary color. So this is a pretty yucky, murky green, which is a good start. Let's add a little bit of red to this. I'm going to try some Indian red in this case, just to further mute that. Okay, and I've got something now that's pretty dark and pretty muted. We'll take a piece of test paper, create a little swatch on here, and I can compare that now to my rock, and it's pretty green. So I'm going to dilute this just a bit more, add some water. My first layer is going to be pretty light because, again, I don't want to go too much more beyond the lightest areas in this rock. Let's try that again, more muted down and more diluted. And that's pretty close. You can see that that color resembles that a little bit. So I think this is a good foundation color. Let's start with that. And we'll just fill in the entire rock. Okay, remember this is going to dry lighter than it looks right now. So I think I'm okay. If I wanted to err on the side of conservative, of safety, I'll lift a little bit of color from the part where the light is hitting most, which is the top left in this case. So I'm going to dry my brush a little bit, get it nice and moist and thirsty, and then just lift a little bit of color from here while this is still wet. Like so. And now we'll let this be. In the meantime, I can start work on one of these other rocks. So for this faceted chiseled rock, I'm going to use a base of Indian red primarily and just mute that a little bit, make it look a little more yellow because I see the rock has a bit more yellow than the straight Indian red. So I'll mix up some Indian red. And again, since this is a foundational layer, a foundational wash that we're going to do, we want it to be pretty light. Take Indian red and then mix a little bit of cadmium yellow with that. Get it diluted. And let's test this on a swatch and compare against our rock. Test that color. It looks to me that this could be dulled down even further. It's still pretty bright. It's still pretty bright red, and we want something that's a bit more brown and muted. So let's take burnt sienna and try mixing that in. And then, again, the best way to dull down a bright color is to add a bit of its complement. So I'm going to add a touch of Viridian green to this red. See if that makes it a bit more muted. Being careful not to overdo it, of course, as the Viridian can pack a punch. Okay, let's try that now. You can see that's a lot less bright, more muted and dirty. Looks closer, but I think we still need a little red, so more Indian red. Okay, let's try this one. That is looking pretty good. Maybe a little bright still, but I think it'll do for right now. As I said, we'll start with a base layer so we can always build off of that afterwards. So I'm going to take this color and, like before, I'm going to start placing it in over the entire area. But since this rock has a bit more variation in areas of extreme light and extreme shadow, and also just areas that are lighter in general in the rock, these more quartz-like crystal areas versus these more opaque areas here. I'm going to be mindful of that as I'm filling this in, and then add some nuance and subtlety to this piece. Sometimes it's helpful to take a second brush and moisten that brush and then use it to create more variation in the areas you're painting. So I'm adding some water in some lighter areas here, and then coming back with my loaded pigment brush and continuing with the very dark areas. And one thing I'm doing here as I'm working is sort of subconsciously I'm aligning some of the brush strokes with the planes or facets that this rock has. And so in this case, for example, we have this really clean cut that has like a verticalness to it. And so instead of painting my brush strokes any which way, I'm kind of going with the grain. And I find that that helps convey that facetedness that's in this rock. Of course, it won't matter so much right now while I'm doing this wash, because the wash is foundational, but it does help at least get it into my mind that there is this very prominent element of this rock that I want to pay attention to, and I want to try to convey that. And as I get more and more detailed and start working more and more dry and the details really start sticking, that'll be important. So I'm going to leave it at that. You can see there's a ton of nuance going on in this rock, and already it's starting to look like there's dimension and volume to it. Let me rinse off my brush. Last but not least, let's get to this rock here. So this rock is very dark. It's an igneous, a volcanic rock, and it's approaching a very dark gray or black even. I want to be careful not to get too dark too quickly with my piece, but I also want to try to match that same tone. So let's get our swatches again. This time we're going to mix a very, very neutral color, and it could be something akin to what we did with the granite stone. This case I'm going to start with a black as a base, just because that gets me very dark very quickly. We'll mix it right here. I'm going to use ivory black as a base, but also mix in a little bit of that French ultramarine. It's kind of a go-to, the French ultramarine. And let's see what we've got. Kind of a bluey black. It's still too bluey, but it's getting close. So again, to neutralize that blue, we're going to do a bit of cadmium yellow, but not too much. And then a little bit of, let's use the same colors, a little bit of Indian red. Let's see what that did. That looks pretty good. You can see just, it's a subtle difference between these two, but we've gone from this bright blue to a much more neutralized, subdued blue. That doesn't even look like blue anymore. It's more of a gray. So let's start with that, and that'll be sort of the lightest areas in our rock, so we can go ahead and paint the entire thing at this point. And I'll point out that when I did the drawing for this rock, I intentionally allowed myself to go a bit darker with the pencil marks than I normally would, because I know this subject is very dark, and so I want those pencil marks to be able to be seen as I'm working. If they were too light in this case, they'd be completely obscured by this wash that I'm doing. And already they're mostly obscured, but I can still make out some of the darker lines, and that'll be helpful again as guidelines. But if you're working with lighter subjects like this rock, which has a lighter foundation, I wanted to create the drawing much more lightly without pressing too hard on the pencil so that those lines don't show through at the end as much. Okay, and we'll leave it like that. Now, as you all know, there are many different styles of watercolor painting. You could do something that's a lot more loose and gestural. You could do something that's very hyper-realistic and intricate. And so you have to find your own strengths and your own interests and work that way. I think on the whole, I tend to try to be too detailed, and sometimes I lose a sort of natural, organic feel to my subjects because I concentrate too much on detail. So in this case, I'm going to try to be a little bit more loose, just to challenge myself. So all of my foundational washes, so to speak, have dried, and some of them have dried a little darker than I expected them to. So one way to compensate for that later is to lift some of the color out, but I'm going to wait till the end to do that, because I have a feeling that even though these look dark now, what remains of these washes at the end will look very light compared to the extreme darks that I'm going to be putting in, for example, in the cast shadows. As I had mentioned earlier, something that stood out to me in the Deer Cave painting was the way that the rocks conveyed weight and volume, and that's because of the way that the light was hitting those rocks and the subsequent shadows that occurred on the opposite sides. So in this case, I have light hitting the top left portions of these rocks, and then I have the underside, sort of the bottom right part of these rocks being more cast in shadow. So I want to emphasize that, and this is particularly true for this granite stone. I'm going to take some of the same color that I had started with and darken it just a bit, in this case with French Ultramarine. Do a test. Look at my stone again. I sense a little more yellow in there. But again, I don't want to make this totally green, so I need to add another color to mute all of that. Now I've added some red, and this is now a bit too brown. It's the fun of color testing, is just combining colors until you end up with something that seems right. Compare that against my rock. I really like where the color is going, but I think it's too dark, so I'll just add a bit more water to dilute it. I want to work up gradually. So here's a good color. Now I'm going to add this in as places where the dark is, and again, trying to work nice and loose. I'm going to add in some of these dark areas. Pretty subtle at first. And I have that bit of a harsh line there. Some of that will fade away as the watercolor dries, but I can also help that by drying my brush a bit and then just mopping up some of the water from there. I'll take a bit more of my color, this time the darker, more intense version of it, and just drop it in here towards the bottom. You can see already that I'm conveying a bit more volume here just by the difference in light to dark going on here. But notice I'm not touching the texture yet. I'm still just working on overall light and dark, trying to create a sense of volume. We'll leave that one as is. Let's go to this one. So in this rock, I've got a lot of the general darks and lights already set in from when I put in my very nuanced first wash, but I'm going to accentuate those now. And I'll take my same color, the Indian red mixture that I had, intensify it a little bit more with some Indian red, and then a bit more yellow. I'm feeling like it needs some cadmium yellow in there. Oop. Of course, that's way too much. Get more Indian red. And then as before, this is super bright, so I have to neutralize it. Let's try, this is sort of an orange, so we can try a blue. Take our French Ultramarine again to neutralize this bright orange. Blue is the complement of orange. Ah, there we go. That's looking better. Let's test that. Be a little more yellow. Let's try that for now. I'm going to use one of these flat brushes to use the tip here to get in some of the fine details. And essentially I'm looking to do a similar thing to what I was doing with the granite stone. It's just deepen some of the values here, darken the darks. But in this case, I'm paying lots of attention to where cracks and crannies in this rock are, because those are what's going to help to convey texture as well as volume. And this rock has a lot of texture going on. And if I squint my eyes and look at the subject, the squinting helps to break down the darks and lights of the form. And so I can more readily, more easily identify where those darks and lights are. And I often will do that as I'm working. Helpful to always be looking at your subject. I'll take a different brush. And I'm going to take some more Indian red because this is looking a little too yellowy for me. Mix some Indian red with that, and then come in now with this. This rock is like painting a whole landscape in and of itself. There's so much going on in here. It's very complex. And I can focus in and get lost in all of that detail very easily. But in my case, I'm trying now as much as possible just to focus on overall forms, really squinting my eyes a bunch as I'm painting to get a sense of what's going on in the rock as a whole without losing too much of the overall shape because of all the details. So right now what I'm doing is I'm putting in a lot of these, like a general detail by using more of a dry brush, adding paint, but you can see I'm getting all this corrugation, all this variation in the texture of the rock here by just doing kind of random marks with my brush and keeping it fairly dry so that it's inconsistent in how it covers, purposefully inconsistent in how it covers. Since I'm now feeling inspired and I'm actually getting close to being done with the body part of this rock, I'm going to take the values one more extreme further, and I've got a lot of reds, Indian red going on here. I'd like to add some variety to that, so I'm going to actually just tap into this other color that I'd mixed up for this igneous rock because it's got more of a blue-grayness to it. So I'm going to cheat and just grab some of this color and then use that in some of these darker areas where it looks like I could use a bit more. It's just a different color going on in there. And this will also deepen the value in here and create more of a contrast between this top plane and then this facet at the bottom. And the more you stare at your subject, the more you realize there's things you're going to miss, but I'm trying to go for overall effect, and I've got a nice volume being conveyed here. So now we're going to transfer to this last piece over here. And this one looks pretty uniform. We really need to convey some volume. I really got to focus on deepening the dark areas and letting this overall hue shine as the light area because it's such a matte, dark rock. So I'm going to mix up more of this color. I believe we were using French Ultramarine. I'm going to go ahead and get a lot of that because I want this to be dark, dark. And we're going to add some cadmium yellow to that. Got that yucky green going on again. I think we added some red, maybe some burnt sienna, Indian red. I guess if I were to claim a color for this gray on this rock, it would be kind of a bluey, very dark bluey gray. So I don't want it to be too brown, too yellow. I want it to be more in the blue spectrum. So I'm going to add some more French Ultramarine to this to make sure it's really touching on dark, 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 dark blue. Let's do a test. And that's a pretty neutral, dark color going on there. Great. So we'll start with that. And here, this is kind of fun. What I'm going to do is, using the guidelines that I have, fill in some of these dark holes, pock marks, focusing on putting my darks on the side of the hole that is most dark, so the part that is deepest. And again, paying attention to my subject for that. And I'm just going to leave them as little, almost like crescents for now, because I'll flesh those out later. But there's so many going on in here that I'm going to take my time and just be a little meticulous since I have the time to do this. I don't want to create too much of a pattern in the rock, or it'll start looking unnatural. But as I'm, again, creating my sense of overall volume, light and dark, I'm going to start adding in these little features as well. I'm really studying my subject once again. I mean, even though I've done the drawing and have all these guidelines that I can barely see now, in here I'm really looking carefully at the drawing and studying it once more to try to get these to be somewhat accurate because they define so much of the character of this rock. And now I've done most of it. I mean, there's still a lot more to go, and especially tons of little marks here and there, but I'm going to wait till last to do that. Right now, what I'm going to do is take my color that I've mixed up and dilute it just a tiny bit more so that I can do, not quite a wash, but I'm going to build up another layer of darkness in this lower right section to really create that volume. So once again, I'm going to squint at my subject, squint at my rock, and then just try to copy some of these dark value areas that are happening. There seems to be a plane in the rock right about here that's kind of facing me, and so it's getting some of the light, and then right around here is where there's an edge, a soft edge, and then this part down here falls into shadow. It's a different plane, so I'm trying to maintain that. You don't want to put too much pressure now on the painting as you're applying these glazes, because you don't want to lift off any of the underlying paint, all that detail work that you just did. Getting there. Now let's add a little bit more of these overall dark and light in these bumpy areas at the top of the rock that seem to have a section of light and shadow in and of themselves, as if they were little hills. Okay, I'm going to leave it for now. Let's return to our granite. We'll keep circling around these pieces. What we've got to do now is deepen, intensify the darks a bit more to create still further contrast, create more of a sense of volume and weight. And you can see here where I put my previous darker mark that it was very wet, and so because of that, the pigment sort of spread throughout very evenly, but it concentrated along the edges and it created a very sharp edge, which is fine, but it did leave that line where I had wanted to create a more diffused area. So I'm going to ignore that for now, and if it is still very sharp at the end, I can try to futz it out a little bit with my brush. So I'm going to go one layer deeper, as I just said. I'll mix up the remainder of this color, and I'm going to squint and look at my subject once more, and then apply this dark glaze on top one more time. And I have this big textural mark here. It's a dark shape, so I'm just going to block it in a little bit as I do this. I'll go in later and make sure that it's well defined, and maybe a tad more dark. Since this isn't too wet right now, I'm going to cheat again and grab a bit of my previously mixed color from this rock, which is a good complement to this area here. And it looks like the darkest areas overall are right here, maybe over here. Get some water on there, smooth this out a little bit. The darkest areas don't seem to be at the very, very bottom edge of the rock, where we have some reflected light from the paper that's hitting it. So I want to avoid getting that part too dark, but maybe something like that works. I'm trying again to be loose. And that looks pretty good. This guy, same thing, needs to be darkened, so I'm going to use the same color because it's a nice neutral gray that contrasts my Indian red that I have sort of throughout here. And we're just going to reinforce the darks one more time. Squinting to see where those darks are most prominent, most present, and then add them in. But I'm working pretty dry now because I'm just adding sort of superficial details, touches. I don't want to influence the foundation of the watercolors that I'd already placed. And then let's get to this guy again. It looks pretty good to me right now, actually. I might use a bit of artistic license and just reinforce those darks a bit more to, again, give us the effect of there being volume and weight in this rock. And I think I'm gonna vary my bluish tone right now, just add a little bit of yellow to make it less blue, essentially. So something like that. You can see it's just slightly different. Well, actually that looks pretty different. And once again, just reinforcing those extreme darks. And for some of these really, really dark pockmarks, I'm going to use some ivory black, make it pretty thick, lots of pigment in there, and see what that does. That's looking pretty good. It's got a nice contrast now. But remember that these holes, these pockmarks, are not just black circles, but they have volume and depth to them. They're really being scooped out of the rock like little caves. And so you want to have a gradation going from deepest part that we can see out towards a more gradual, lighter area as it approaches the outside. So because it's helpful for me to see that, I'm going to take these crescents now, just use a bit of water and start to create a more gradual transition between the extreme dark towards the outside. And use this to apply some nuance to the rock as well. So I've got a lighter tone in here. And I can use this now too to start creating some more imperfections in the areas between the pockmarks. Finally, I'm going to take my brush and mix up some ivory black. You can see that's just black as it is, and make my brush pretty dry so that I can use the individual hairs on the brush on the tip of it to create some texture. All these little textural marks between some of the larger pockmarks that I've more carefully drawn in, and just start to add in some of that speckly texture. If you have a brush that's been worn down over the years, so it's just like a stubby tip with lots of little frayed hairs sticking out, that's the perfect brush for this kind of work. And then reinforce these blacks one more time, because we want it to be very dark and prominent. And also just start to do a little bit more texturing. Just adding some random marks here and there, particularly where the darks are present, meaning the darks of the overall rock, like lower right section, to again emphasize that difference in value. And if you have a tiny brush like this one here, that can be very useful for this kind of work, especially at this scale that I'm working. If I were working much larger, then I could afford to use a bigger brush. All right, so that's looking pretty good there. Let's give that a rest, and we'll come back to our granite. So I'm going to continue with this tiny brush. We're pretty much ready now to start adding in our texture, which is the dark blacks that we're seeing on the surface. And for that, I'm going to use some of my previous ivory black, so I'll mix some of that up again. And now looking at the subject again, to me those dark areas look a little, well, they look pretty black to be honest, but we don't want it to be pure ivory black because that's too much, that's too harsh. We want something that harmonizes a bit more with the colors that we have going on in this rock, even if they're subtle. So I'm going to add a bit of a blue tinge to this, maybe a bit of Viridian green as well. Again, just to provide some color. It's still going to be very dark, very black, but to our eye it's not going to look as harsh as if it's just straight ivory black from the tube. And then let's do a test. So you can see how that's slightly in the blue spectrum, but it's still pretty much a black, and especially if it's concentrated, it looks pretty dark and black. So we'll take our small brush now, and we're going to start adding in this texture, sort of how we did it for this rock with the pockmarks, but this time a little bit more sporadically, more randomly. Of course, paying attention to the major textural forms, but then sort of letting the brush go wild a bit in other areas. So first, paying attention to major textural forms. I have this big shape in here that I'm going to kind of just quickly copy with my brush and my eye, looking at it as I'm doing so, but allowing myself to be inaccurate, just going for overall form, and then working up the rest of the area using the tip of my brush. But really looking, I'm really trying to emulate the shapes that I'm seeing, not just random blobs necessarily. I want the character of these blobs, which are, there's sort of like a fractalness going on in them. And then another thing is I'm paying attention to the outside contour, the shaping. It's rounded, so I want those marks to round as well as they move around the shape. And as my brush starts losing pigment, I'll use that to my advantage to just do a bit of dry brushing in areas where we've got some more kind of patchy textures going on, less prominent shapes, of which there are a lot. All right, that's looking pretty good. We'll take some blue, French ultramarine again, and mix that up. Make it a musky, murky French ultramarine, and make it somewhat diluted and dry. You can see I have a good dry brush going there to create some soft, speckly textures. I'll take that and add it in a couple areas where I see more sort of haziness or cloudiness going on in the texture. And then the last thing I'm going to do is, if I look at the subject, you can see that where the black areas are in this rock, they're sort of indented, and the whiter areas, the lighter areas, are sticking out a bit more. And so there's a bit of volume difference going on in this texture. It's not just like a quail egg where it's a really smooth surface with speckles of black and speckles of light. We have some undulation going on. And so to call attention to that, we're going to give some light and shadow difference to the lighter areas, the whiter areas, to just give them some more volume in and of themselves. And I'll use the same colors, so let me clean off my brush. We'll take some of this same color, but really dilute it, because we want this to be fairly subtle. Something like that. And keep a brush that's not completely soaking, but not dry either. And then pay attention to where some of these darks and lights occur by looking at the lighter areas in between these dark marks and just picking a bottom right side of these light areas, giving them a bit of dark boost like this to help the light areas pop. I'm also using this to further darken the bottom right half of this stone, again, just to emphasize that it's round and give it some more contrast in that way. But at the risk of overworking, I may just call it at that. I'm going to move on to this stone now and add the cast shadow. So for the cast shadow, in this case, I'm going to use a base of Indian red, since that's the primary color we have going in here. So let me mix that up. And I'm going to really subdue this in Indian red by adding some French ultramarine. But if you look at the cast shadow in this subject, you see that it's got like a bit of a red hue to it. It's not just black or blue or something. So by mixing a bit of the primary color in there, it seems like it could do a good job. So I've got a color mixed up now, a dark color for the shadow. I'm going to wipe off my brush, and in this case I'm going to use this flat brush, and I'm going to take some water and place that water inside the outlines of my shadow. Then I'll take another brush, grab my color, and start to drop it in. I can take a dampened brush, damp, not wet, and use that to extend the boundaries where my shadow is, and also to diffuse the edge a tiny bit more, and that way it doesn't look so harsh, so stiff of an edge, something like that. But pay attention to the individual shadows in your rock, especially if you're using your own rock, because you'll want to always stick by the mantra of painting what you see. So there we go. This one over here, I'm going to mix up French ultramarine, and then we're going to subdue that with some red, maybe some Alizarin Crimson, and definitely a touch of cadmium yellow to really neutralize that bright purple. Oh, and way too much. Let's go back to the French ultramarine. Lots of French ultramarine. I'm going to add some Indian red as more of an orange contrast complement. But I like some shadows to be kind of on the blue side of things, especially for a dark subject like this. So let's test that. It's pretty close to the hue of the rock that we have going on, which is okay. And actually in our subject, we see those two blending together, both the cast shadow and the subject, where they meet on the lower right edge, so this could be okay. So now, same as before, take my other brush, wet it a bit, and then add some water to this cast shadow. And now take my mixed color and drop it in. Same as before, take a damp other brush, blend that edge just a little bit more so that it doesn't dry so sharp. And then in this case, I want to intensify the shadow a bit more where it comes closer to the rock, especially down here. So while it's still damp, I'll do just that. And I may give it one more pass once it's completely dry. For now, I'm going to leave it like that. Now this one over here, same thing. This one to me seems like the shadow, the cast shadow has a slight yellow tinge to it. So I'm going to recycle some of the same pigment that I mixed up for this last rock, but add a little bit of cadmium yellow to that. See if I can push it just ever slightly into the yellow range. Still keep it pretty much a neutral gray, something like that. Okay, same process. I'll take some water, a damp brush, and these cast shadows are on, of course, a flat white surface. If you have rocks in the field casting shadows, they're going to be casting it all over all kinds of other forms. So once again, you draw and you paint what you see. Pay attention to those forms and put your shadows in accordingly. Come right up against the edge. Drop in some more intense dark here at the bottom, right up against the edge. Then take my damp other brush, fuzz the edge just a little bit. This can also be done when the piece is more dry, and actually I think in this case I'm going to wait. Well, I'll do a little bit now and then a little more later, but you want to be careful not to introduce water. Okay, so this is a little drier now. Take a lightly moistened brush, just damp, and come along the edge. See if a round brush does a better job. Something like that. And then over here, I'm going to intensify the shadow now that this has dried a bit. Come in and create a crisp division between the rock itself and the shadow underneath. Just accentuate that contrast. This one could use a tiny bit too, but not very much. The more there's a contrast between the dark cast shadow and then relatively lighter subject, the more it feels like there's a 3D-ness to the subject, like it's popping off of the page. All right. Well, and there we have it, our 3 rocks. Thanks for joining me today to learn how to paint rocks in watercolor. Rocks come in such varied shapes, sizes, and colors that they always provide a fun challenge to paint. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing to this channel to check out my other demonstrations of watercolor painting. You can also find the other videos in this series at The Foster at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.